All right, folks, I think we're live now. Someone tell me from my staff if we're not live. This is the way these productions tend to go these days. But trusting that we are, I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank dozens of you who have already given us a head start by sending in some excellent questions on Facebook and by email. And thanks to our media outlets who are broadcasting this program up and down my beautiful congressional district. Here's how it's going to go. We're going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes delving into something that I think has been on many of our minds lately, the transfer of power between President Trump and President-elect Joe Biden. Is it going to happen? And exactly how does it happen? What can we expect over the next 2 months? And after that, we need to talk about what needs to be done in this country to shore up our laws and institutions and to make sure that we're always holding people accountable to the rule of law. I'll start by introducing two outstanding constitutional scholars that are joining me as special guests tonight. And then we'll jump into what I know is going to be a very dynamic conversation. I will try to make sure that we're answering as many of your questions as possible as we go. So let's welcome my special guests, starting with Caroline Frederickson. She is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. Formerly, she was the president of the American Constitution Society, and that is the leading progressive legal organization in the United States. She has written numerous books and scholarly articles, and she's also joined me for a number of previous town halls on presidential accountability as we have navigated this 4-year odyssey of the Trump presidency. Caroline, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
So my other special guest is Paul Rosensweig, and Paul's conservative legal credentials are just impeccable. He's been a member of the Federalist Society going all the way back to the 1980s. He has worked in all three branches of our federal government, was a senior counsel to Ken Starr during the investigation and impeachment of President Clinton. And he went on to serve as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security in the George W. Bush administration. And you know, Donald Trump has been criticized for dividing our country and turning us against each other. But I've got to give credit where credit is due. Donald Trump is the reason I made a new Republican friend about 1.5 years ago. I was trying to persuade some of my House colleagues to pursue impeachment, and Paul Rosensweig agreed to come over to my house and to join a liberal Democratic lawyer, Jill Wine-Banks, who had been one of the Watergate impeachment attorneys. And they met with several of my colleagues and me to educate us about impeachment and share their perspective. I'm sure that I could find all kinds of things to disagree with Paul about. But the truth is, I deeply respect his qualifications, his integrity, and the fact that in these critical years we've just lived through, he did not hesitate to put our country above his political party. Paul is currently a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, where he's been a very insightful critic of Donald Trump's erosion of American principles. Paul, thank you for spending some time with a couple of lefties like me and Caroline, and for giving my constituents the benefit of your insights tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I'm indeed honored to be here and delighted to have made a friend of you over the past several years. It has been my true honor and pleasure.
Thank you. Well, let's get started. So at the 1 hour mark, some of our media partners are going to cut away, but I'm going to keep going for about another 15 to 20 minutes after that. And then I'll let everybody get back to their lives after about 1 hour and 15 or 1 hour and 20 minutes. Before we go too far into this transfer of power question, though, there's sort of a threshold question. I've got a number of constituents writing in about the election itself. Tim McCloskey, for example, asks, was the election fair and did Joe Biden actually win? We've had another question about all sorts of irregularities. I've gotten constituents writing about many of the claims that are being made by President Trump and his legal team. So let me ask the two of you, do we have confidence that Joe Biden is in fact the president-elect as we speak?
Well, I mean, if you don't mind, I'll start. I did also just want to say one other thing, which is to mention that I'm a professor at Georgetown Law, but I don't want to neglect my main occupation right now. So, a wonderful place to be. So yeah, I think this election has been scrutinized like no other, and I think it has actually allowed us to find some real solace in the upstanding behavior of a number of state election officials who, despite pressure that they were put under by the president himself, members of his own party who have been maligned, abused, and threatened, they stood by the results. There have been recounts, there have been hand counts, there have been observers watching these counts go on. Donald Trump and his campaign have brought 20 plus lawsuits and lost them all. I can't think of an election that we could be more confident of probably than this one. I mean, it has exposed a number of threshold problems with our electoral process that we need to examine and discuss to make it work better. But I can't think of ever having been more confident in an outcome.
Paul?
I would agree. I mean, I would say it this way. There can be no doubt, none whatsoever, that Joe Biden won this election. In saying that, I join no less than fellow Republicans Attorney General Bill Barr, who said there was no evidence of widespread fraud. And my good friend, Trump appointee, now dismissed, head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs, who said correctly that this was the most secure election, at least from a cybersecurity perspective and from the perspective of the voting machines, in the history of America. Anybody who says otherwise is really not connected to reality, I fear. 80 million votes beats 73 million votes every day and twice on Sunday.
Yeah, I think the only thing not secure is Mr. Krebs himself. He has faced withering threats, including death threats from Donald Trump's lawyer on public radio cast. So let me jump into some of these more specific, excuse me, questions I've gotten from constituents claiming that some of these Trump claims about more people voting than there are even eligible voters, et cetera. You know, I want to urge people to do their own fact checking. It's really easy to do. If you type into YouTube a question like, you know, was there voter fraud? Did more people vote than we have registered voters? You're going to get crazy people telling you conspiracy theories. But if you go and just Google it and look for credible, trustworthy sources, every one of these things is debunked. In fact, I found on USA Today kind of a one-stop shop of debunking every single one of these claims. No, you don't have more people voting than were eligible to vote. And if you did, wow, would that be an easy case to win in court, right? That's like prima facie evidence right there. And the fact that they've lost dozens and dozens of these cases thrown out summarily shows you that there it really is no evidence to back these things up. But I do want to ask the two of you about the state of play on these legal challenges, because I think there are still a few winding their way through the court system. Where do we stand on the legal challenges?
Well, I think anything that's left is really, it's sort of the tail of the dog. They were all dogs. President Trump and his campaign were berated by some of his own appointees for not only the thinness of the arguments and evidence, but the lack of arguments and evidence, coming into the courtroom with nothing. And people have asked me, don't you think, aren't you surprised that Trump appointed judges or Republican appointed judges generally were so negative on these cases? And I say, well, no, actually they have reputations to protect, and they don't want to be seen as simply hacks who are willing to make rulings that are in complete defiance of all of, that are based on no evidence and are on faulty legal premises. And so I think what we have here is lawyers with an empty briefcase at this point. And I think we're all aware of the sort of ludicrous press conference that both Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell have had. Sidney Powell in particular kind of putting out some kind of super crazy conspiracy theories about Venezuela working with, who knows who to do this and that, based on, I don't know where she was reading that on, the dark internet or something, but she really discredited, I think, whatever remaining respect there might have been for Trump's legal team. And I think they're left with a bunch of nothing at this point.
So today, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected Donald Trump's last challenge in Wisconsin. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court rejected the last challenge of one of your colleagues, Michael Kelly, who had sued to overturn the mail-in voting provisions of Pennsylvania and discard 7 million votes, which was quite amazing. The
But not his own,
president's
right? Not his own votes. The
What?
congressional votes were going to be okay, just the presidential.
Yes, yes. His reelection was okay. It was just the Trump votes, which, I mean, I think if I had to characterize my own dismay here at the arc of the argument for President Trump, it's the lack of internal consistency. I mean, as a conservative, I have stood for the last 30 years for the idea that the federal government should not get involved in state law business. Now, maybe you disagree with that, maybe you don't. But all of the conservatives who've been standing for that principle for years are now running into federal court saying, overturn state election law. We changed our minds. When we lose, we want to change the rules. And for me, the key to understanding what's happening now is to realize that so much of the legal challenges that are being brought are actual reverses of long-held conservative legal propositions of the independence of state law. And as Carolyn said, lots of judges, good conservative Republican judges, are looking at that and saying, no, I'm not following there. That's not the way that the law works, not how I understand it.
So
I would
just
say,
one last piece. I'm going to come to you right now, Caroline. One last piece on the election integrity side of this. One of my constituents, Joe, asks for your views, because I think he believes the Brennan Center has written about the untrustworthiness of electronic voting. And he believes, in this theory that the machines were rigged against Trump. What can you say about that?
Well, I'm not the expert of some of my colleagues who are really brilliant experts, but I would say actually the systems that we've been looking at in the particular battleground states, I mean, they have hand audits. They had backup systems. They were prepared for this. So if you look at each of those states, you can see how they handled the difficult issue of making sure that the vote was secure, and they did it above and beyond. And I think to go back to Mr. Krebs, there was no cyber threat. That would have been the main way of manipulating those machines. There's no evidence of that. In some ways, one of the weaknesses of our system is also the strength. That is, it's highly inefficient to have so many different systems of elections. Having all the different jurisdictions have a different approach. The upside of that is it's really hard to hack that. It's really hard to manipulate it. And in this case, we have not only no evidence that there was any manipulation, but actually an affirmative statement by the head of cybersecurity that the systems held. They were strong, and we came through despite a bunch of misinformation coming from the president, which was so unhelpful to the integrity of our election system, because we want people to believe in democracy so they participate and understand the civic duty and the great achievement that the United States has made in being a strong democracy. We want to continue that. If we have a president who continues to disparage the voting process, that is really, really dangerous for our system of government.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
I actually co-authored that report with some of the Brennan people. Okay. And so it's really important to understand the difference between something called DREs, direct recorded voting, and electronic voting with paper backup. What we argued against, and I stand by it, is we should change away from systems that don't have paper records of electronically tabulated ballots. And the good news is that since that report came out, most of the states have changed. We went from a situation in 2016 where about 82% of American ballots had paper backup recording. In the recently completed election, it was up to 95%. There are only
Wow.
2, maybe 3 states left that only have electronic voting. Louisiana is one. None of them are battleground states. So when they did a hand recount in Georgia, what they did was they compared the electronic ballot counting of the voting machines with the actual paper records, and they counted the paper records by hand, and they were accurate to the voting to the 99.9911%. And I don't know about you, but in my world, that's pretty darn good. So we've changed now to paper backups, and that's the key point of the report that was captured by governments over the last 2-3 years.
Thank you for adding that, Paul. And let me stay with you, because one of the great questions I got from a constituent kind of suggested that we were picking on President Trump and that we didn't seem to be all that concerned with the peaceful transition of power between the Bush and Obama administration when a Democrat won. But in fact, you're with us tonight, Paul, and you were part of that transfer of power. So you actually were involved in a transfer in the other direction. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the mechanics of it and what your personal experience in a transfer of power was.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And honestly, it was probably one of the best experiences of my professional career, even though my team had lost. In the days immediately after the election, a team of about 25 people from President Obama's incoming administration came to the Department of Homeland Security. We gave them lots of space. We gave them security clearances. We gave them briefing books that were, practically stacked to the wall, to the ceiling, with explanations of the programs that we were administering, many of which were highly controversial, but most of which were just good government working and proceeding. And over the course of the next 2 months, we had regular meetings, started off daily, slowed down a bit as we got towards the end, as they began to get their feet under them, where they would ask us questions. They read the briefing materials and they say, why'd you do this? What did you mean by this? And we were under direction from Andrew Card, the chief of staff to President Bush. We were completely transparent with them. We gave them everything that we possibly could, everything they asked for. If we didn't give it to them, it was only because we didn't think to give it to them. And it was really an uplifting experience, because here was a Democratic team coming in to review a Republican administration, and they came in with a lot of thoughtful criticism that they thought what we were doing they didn't understand. And there were a number of instances where we explained what we'd done, and they'd say, "Oh, I understand that now. I still don't like it, but at least I understand that you're not a moron. You didn't do it because you're evil. We just had a different approach to it." And I like to say that the end of it was one of the most interesting pieces of it, because Janet Napolitano, the incoming Secretary of Homeland Security, wanted to celebrate President Obama's inauguration. She wanted to go to the ball, and she wanted to drink and have wine. She also understood that the inauguration was a time of risk from terrorist attack, and that unlike outgoing Secretary of Homeland Security Chertoff, she didn't know how to run the department. She didn't know who to call in case of emergency. So she actually asked Chertoff to stand on for an extra 48 hours with a small cadre of his own staff who knew where the bathrooms were, metaphorically speaking, so that she could enjoy the inauguration. And she took the reins of power, I guess it was the day after that, at the end of the day, and Chertoff then went off on his vacation. And that's how a transition's supposed to work.
Yeah. Well, we'll now have to consider whether that can happen now. And I guess the first question about that, one of my constituents asked, how does this transition work? Is it called for specifically in the Constitution? Are there statutes that lay it out? Because I think many of us were horrified that the GSA director was just withholding transition cooperation. Now that's changed, and we're seeing that begin to happen. But what's the legal framework for this thing we call a transition?
Well, if you don't mind, Paul, I'll jump in. In 1963, Congress passed the Presidential Transition Act, which was designed to provide for a peaceful and orderly transition of power between administrations. And it is the role of the head of the the GSA to authorize the provision of resources and access to staff to the incoming administration. Normally, that's a fairly pro forma kind of process, but Emily Murphy, who's the head of GSA now, took 3 weeks to actually issue the letter telling the departments to move forward with the process and releasing the money. She had argued that until all of the issues in every state were resolved, that she couldn't say that President-elect Biden had actually won the election. I don't want to cast aspersions on her. It seems pretty doubtful to me that that was actually a true rendering of her position. But she had been in consultation with the person who was the head of GSA at the end of the Clinton administration when the Florida issue was going on at the election of George Bush and Al Gore. If I gave her the benefit of the doubt, and I will try and do so, I would say that she was trying to adhere to a kind of a process that respected the states moving forward with their own certification process. But it did, I don't think it was fatal. Obviously, it was not fatal to the Biden administration. But it was a hindrance not to be able to get in and talk to people. And I have to say, one thing that really worries me right now, and I don't know if Paul has an opinion on this, but is I think the real danger that President Trump poses to the civil service, his effort to create, it seems like it could be a purge of a certain level of high-level experts within the different agencies that might prevent President-elect Biden from having the best career people who've been in there for some time be able to stay because of the change in their status from protected civil service to political, and then they can all be fired. So we'll see what happens, but it does worry me.
I agree with Caroline that we dodged a bullet. I have to say, though, that I was much more concerned, perhaps, than it sounds like she was at in those 20 days. The 9/11 Commission called out the delayed transition from Clinton to Bush as one of the reasons for the inadequacy of our national security response and our inability to recognize the flashing red lights of the terrorist acts that became the 9/11 attacks on the United States. So for me, the continuity of government is less about expertise. I mean, those are very important things. I don't want to diminish them, but it really is about something absolutely vital, the national security of the United States and the seamless transition. We're very fortunate, I think, that it seems like President Biden is picking an experienced team, people who have who will be able to come back to agencies they worked at. Mr. Blinken at the Department of State, Jake Sullivan was his national security advisor earlier, and I'm sure that I'm going to dislike some of what they do in the future, but I'm very pleased to see that he's picking a team that is going to be able to hit the ground running. And so happily, that 20-day delay looks like it's going to be water under the bridge.
Well, I wouldn't want, I just have to say, I agree very much with your remarks. I wouldn't want you to think that I was petrified, actually. I was terrified for so many reasons. Certainly the national security issue was a big piece of that, as well as just the question of whether we were going to come to a huge conflict with the failure to recognize Biden as the president-elect altogether, which was also a tremendous worry for me. Did keep me awake many a night.
Yeah. So what if President Trump refuses to leave, Professor?
Well, President Trump will no longer be the president come January 20th. And so he, I'd hate to suggest that he'll be frog marched out of the White House by Secret Service, but that is probably the way it would be. I can't imagine that is he's not going to want that photograph. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's and I think the fact that he's already discussing in a more and more public way his interest in running for president again,
Yeah.
I think he would not want to have the humiliation of being escorted out of out of the White House in handcuffs or by force, because that would be an image that would, let's face it, that would live forever on the internet. And it's something I think we all know that above all, Donald Trump doesn't like to lose or be humiliated. And I think this would just be something he would avoid at all costs.
Well, I'll certainly ask Paul the same question. And, I worry about this today a lot less than I did a couple months ago. And yet, just yesterday, Mike Flynn, President Trump's former NSA director, a 3-star general, literally publicly called for martial law to overturn the election and essentially install Trump as an unelected president, which is also known as a dictator. So there are still folks out there hanging on to this notion that maybe President Trump doesn't have to leave. He continues to say things that fuel this to a degree. And so what are your thoughts?
Well, first off, I think that President Trump's continued public posturing is shameful. The 46-minute video that he released yesterday was unprecedented in American history and just destructive of American norms. I think General Flynn has, he used to be a very well-respected general. Yeah, he was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. You don't get that job if they think you're crazy. But I think his experiences have kind of driven him over some invisible line into conspiracyhood. Like Carolyn, I think it is highly, highly unlikely that President Trump will actually physically refuse to leave. He will morally refuse to leave. He'll have his kickoff for the 2024 campaign at the same time as Biden's inauguration speech and try and get Fox News to cover him instead of President Biden's inaugural speech. But if he were to refuse to leave, I think I forget who it was. Some commentator said it best. The government is very good at kicking out squatters and trespassers on federal lands. We do it all the time in federal housing, and this wouldn't be any different.
Yeah. What about just one other piece of the mechanics of all this happening? And by the way, Paul, I think it goes without saying the Bush administration did not require every state to certify the election results in 2008 before they began the presidential transfer of power, right?
They did it the day after the election when it was clear that Obama had beaten McCain. The certification there was the day after the election.
So some of these, while nominally defensible, some of these rationales really don't seem like good faith. Would you both agree with that?
Totally.
Very much.
So what about the Electoral College, which is, one of the last steps in the road to the inauguration and the formal transfer of powers? Is everything taken care of? I've got a constituent that writes, are all the ways in which the election can be stolen through the Electoral College being taken care of?
Well, I believe so. I mean, I think there are a couple of Republican members in the House who are suggesting they're going to challenge, but they don't have the votes. It's an incredibly Byzantine process, the whole Electoral College, and personally, I would like to see us get rid of it. But we could talk about that another time if you want to talk about election reform issues. But I think the fact that all the states have certified and they've sent they're not going to be competing slates of electors, and so that was I think the major anxiety that people had was that there would be 2 slates of electors from Michigan. Say, for example, the Republicans in Michigan who were invited to the White House and apparently harangued or berated by President Trump to defy the will of the voters and overturn after the vote their chosen candidate and send a different slate of electors based on the preference of the Republican leaders in the Michigan State House. And they refused to do that. There was the leaders in Pennsylvania also shot that down well before were never called to the White House even. And so I think how it's progressed is that we won't see those competing slates of electors. And so that, I think, really puts to rest the question or the fear that we would have any kind of anything happen with the electors that would be anything but a pro forma process.
I think it's time for me to once again shout out to my fellow conservative jurists. The Supreme Court just decided earlier this year that states may prohibit their electors from being faithless. That is, an elector who's pledged to Trump can be prohibited from casting his ballot for Biden and vice versa. And so the chances of there being rogue electors in the Electoral College is virtually non-existent. And as Carolyn said, I mean, the last thread is from your colleague, Mo Brooks, who you ought to go talk to and ask him, what is he thinking of? He's a congressman who wants to challenge the election results because he thinks that 73 million is really bigger than 80 million. And again, I kind of wonder about that.
There's some math issues there. I will talk to Mo about that. Before we leave this issue of the Electoral College and other parts of the transition, one of my constituents Robert suggested that the whole notion of having a town hall focused on the transition of power is vindictive and singling out President Trump in a way that suggests that we're becoming a banana republic. And so let me just say, I could never have imagined holding a town hall about the transition of power in any other time. I wouldn't have needed to do it because, as Paul has just shared with us from his perspective, being a member of a Republican administration, it's something we've always taken for granted. People have always just done it. I think the whole reason we're talking about this, and some of us are worrying about it, is that for the first time in history, to my knowledge, a president has openly mused about not giving up power, about trying to overturn a democratic election, and all these things that are totally unprecedented. And believe me, I wish I didn't have any cause to ask these questions and pull in constitutional experts to try to put some of them to rest. But it is where we are because of what this president has done that no one has ever done before. But certainly, if either of my experts think that we're picking on Donald Trump and that this isn't a necessary conversation, let me know.
Not at all. And I would just say, so I served in the Clinton administration. I worked in the White House, and I worked. I had just left the White House to go back to work for Senator Daschle, who was the Democratic leader in the Senate, a year or so before the end of the administration. And I was with Senator Daschle when Bush v. Gore, sort of the whole process in Florida went forward. And I actually, on a night in December that Al Gore announced that he was conceding and basically accepting the decision of the Supreme Court. I was actually at a holiday party at the vice president's home for many staffers. It wasn't like it was a small party. It was a lot of Democratic staffers and members. And I just remember, it was heartbreaking for me, obviously, but it was a point of where, in a situation where we were talking about a difference of 500 votes or something like that, in a fairly contested Supreme Court decision, Al Gore rose above and recognized that the continuation of our democracy was of the most importance. And I think of that and contrast that to as what Paul said. 80 million is a lot more than 73 million. The irony here is that Donald Trump lost to Biden by the same number of electoral votes that he beat Hillary Clinton by, even though he lost by 3 million popular votes. And he called that win a landslide. And the way he's behaved with this, with this election, I think has just been rather shocking to me. But I guess maybe not so shocking based on the past 4 years, where we've seen any number of norms crumble, and the accountability measures that we have taken for granted, dealing with the president, his family, their finances, and others, really fall apart.
Thank you for reminding us of that. If anyone had cause to maybe be a little bit petulant, it might have been Al Gore in 2000, just 500 votes away from the presidency, and controversial circumstances, but he didn't. He knew how important this peaceful transfer of power was. And so to have it happen now, when Donald Trump got trounced by well over 6 million votes and a pretty lopsided electoral map, it really seems almost gratuitous. I want to pivot a little bit, though, to the issue of accountability and sort of beginning to look past the transfer of power. Many of my constituents have written about whether Donald Trump and his family and his senior administration officials will be held fully accountable for what they believe are misdeeds. Some of them have urged me to have congressional hearings to dig into this and to make sure that we do what we can. I will say, from the congressional side of this question, we'll certainly follow up, I think, using our oversight authority on anything that we find was done wrong or illegally. But we can't do bills of attainder. We can't just legislate a criminal punishment against people because we don't like them. And I think there are similar sort of checks on how far we can go with the federal judicial and law enforcement system in the next administration. There does come a point where it begins to look political, and you almost do as much damage to the rule of law if you err on that side than by not holding people accountable. So there's just a lot to consider here. And I'm really interested in what the two of you would add to this question of whether Donald Trump and his family and colleagues should be held accountable for any crimes they may have committed in office.
I approached this with a great deal of caution. If we prosecute people for that which they did while in office, we do really run the risk of looking just like a banana republic, where victor's justice runs rampant. On the other hand, if we fail to take into account the manifest illegality of a person's activities, we return to a time when the king can do no wrong. And we had a revolution, 250 years ago about that very fact, against the idea that
Thomas Paine said in the United States, the law is king, and in other countries, the king is law. So
exactly. For me, I kind of divide the field. The easy question for me, and the one that I think should be the focus of where I would look going forward, is that becoming president or becoming the son of a president doesn't mean that everything you did as a citizen before you became president is suddenly wiped clean. And there is ample predication for an investigation of President Trump and his organization's business activities in the days that predated his presidency. If his niece Mary is to be believed, he committed probate fraud. If his lawyer Michael Cohen is to be believed, he committed mortgage fraud and tax fraud. If the tax records that the New York Times put out are accurate, he hid money, and Ivanka may have committed tax fraud as well. I'm not saying that those are clearly true, but I'm saying that there's ample evidence on the public record to justify an investigation of those activities. And none of them trench upon anything political that has happened in the last 4 years, the Ukraine or emoluments or any of the things that probably are more top of your brain and maybe top of your constituents' brains. Those, for me, are just more fraught. And if I can achieve the same goal, and for me, the goal is reaffirming the idea that nobody is above the law. If I can achieve that objective for America without going down the road of criminalizing something that some of your constituents would call just political differences and making Donald Trump, picking on Donald Trump for his politics, we can, I won't say have our cake and eat it too, but we can achieve rough justice in a way that I think advances the rule of law without turning us into that banana republic. So that's kind of where I come down.
Caroline?
I agree very much with Paul. I mean, just say a couple of things. A lot of the real violations that were committed by Donald Trump and his family are not necessarily, as Paul had suggested, illegal while in office. A lot of the laws, like the Hatch Amendment and other financial issues, are not actually applicable to the president. And so there's a whole swath of kind of disclosure, transparency, regulatory policies that are that he is immune from. So there are areas where we can certainly address that going forward. But what he did was he kind of ripped the he ripped the cover off and showed us that the things that we took for granted in terms of norms that we expected presidents to respect were not enforceable in any legal way. And so much of what has been written about, much of what has been really troubling and in fact scandalous, I think, to many about the behavior of the Trump family in the White House has actually not been illegal. Now, that being said, I think it is, we can distinguish between what, what the federal government does and what state governments have been doing. And that is state and local. That it might not be the best move for a whole lot of reasons for a Biden administration to all of a sudden use its Justice Department to investigate deeply into potential crimes at the federal level, because there is an avenue, as Paul suggested, to hold the president accountable for the kinds of legal, real crimes that might have been committed before he was elected, that are being actually pursued already in New York by the district attorney Cyrus Vance and by the Attorney General of New York and by others. So I think, and in fact, Carl Racine, the Attorney General of the District of Columbia, I think just deposed Ivanka Trump yesterday in a related case. And so I think we do need to ensure that the crimes that might have been committed before a president becomes president aren't immunized forever.
You don't have any doubt that he and his family and others will be held accountable for those type of crimes, right?
Well, I don't know that I can't say they're all hard to prove, hard to bring to conclusion in a favorable way for the prosecutors. So, I want to leave that. We'll see how that all plays out. I mean, there's a lot of legal maneuvering still left in those cases, but I do think the idea that they go forward is important. But
I two of you a little deeper into the weeds on some of this, because if it were all just about crimes before his presidency began, that's a nice clean point of demarcation. And we're going to talk in a moment about things we need to do going forward to put some teeth in the law, like the emoluments clause, like other things that for the last 4 years have had me pulling my hair out because I thought this has to be illegal. This must be something that's actionable. And I think we've learned in a few areas that the law needs some fixes. But there are other things that are a little messier. One of them is obstruction of justice. And the Mueller report laid out maybe half a dozen seemingly prima facie examples of obstructing justice. That's a real federal crime committed while he was president of the United States. One of the arguments that we heard against impeachment was that, well, this can be pursued after he leaves office. So it's not that clean. And then we just learned this week about the possibility of a bribery for pardon scandal. So let's stay in this messy world of crimes that may have been committed on his watch as president of the United States.
Well,
go ahead, Paul.
when the Mueller report came out, I joined a group of 1,000 former federal prosecutors in signing a letter that said that the facts alleged in the Mueller report were of the sort that we would have seen as criminal obstruction of justice charges that could be brought against any other citizen. And as you said, Mr. Mueller, bound as he was by the Department of Justice's policy against indicting sitting presidents, chose not to bring those charges. But we saw what he described as clearly obstructive in nature and therefore potentially prosecutable. So in my view, any decision on, well, first off, the facts need to be developed more because Mueller just laid out kind of, the outlines of it. We would want a complete investigation. But if the facts are as described in the report, then frankly, the decision on whether or not to indict the president for those obstructive acts after he leaves office is a classic discretionary judgment within the bounds of the prosecutor.
And President-elect Biden has said this will be the decision of the next attorney general. He's not going to meddle with it and, show him neither fear nor favor. But you would say that the next attorney general at least has enough grounds to bring in McGahn and do some investigating on this?
I would put it this way. 40 years ago, Ed Levy wrote the investigative guidelines for the FBI and DOJ, and they require predication in order to open an investigation. And predication is a credible basis in fact for undertaking the investigation. Doesn't mean it's true. It just means you've got a credible basis to start. Using that traditional method that we've been using since the 1970s, there is predication for the Department of Justice to open up an obstruction of justice investigation of Donald Trump if they choose to do so. And if President Biden chooses not to get engaged, which I would strongly commend him for not doing, because that's one of the norms that President Trump has broken, it will be the decision of the Attorney General, whomever he or she may be.
So let's go to the professor. But before we leave you, Paul, what about the bribe for pardon revelation?
Wow. Well, that's too soon to tell. I mean, who was bribing whom, and did the president know about it? And it's all redacted. I want to know a lot more about that before I kind of say. But certainly, we know that there's predication for that investigation because they've already started it against whoever it is for whatever it is they did. It's one of those wonderful mysteries. We should probably start a pool as to who the briber is and who the bribee is.
I think we know the bribee, but Professor.
I want to be a fly on the wall of Judge Howell's chambers there, see what actually is going on, because I agree it was very it perked everybody's curiosity to read about some lawyer, because it was some lawyer, and so there was immediate suspicion about who that might be. Well, it is very complex. I would say, as you may, I don't know if you recall, but I testified a couple of times in front of the Judiciary Committee relating to issues around the Mueller report and obstruction of justice. And I do commend President-elect Biden for indicating that this will be left to the next Attorney General. One of the complexities here, which I just would have to be resolved by the next Attorney General, is that one of the things that Mueller did not have was the testimony of the president. And so, with the issue of intent being such a large part of being able to prosecute in a successful way, not having Trump having spoken, whether that could be accomplished after he leaves the White House, would strengthen that case. But I think that was a big issue for Mueller about why it wasn't as definitive. And also, I think the question of impeachment and what role that played, he did defer to Congress as suggesting that since he couldn't indict, that it was Congress's role to pursue impeachment, which in fact Congress did pursue exactly on obstruction of justice, and whether President-elect Biden would consider that maybe kind of forecloses, or the Attorney General might think that issue has been, spoken to because the president was not in fact impeached. Now, I want to make clear, impeachment does not require a crime to have been committed. Abuse of public trust is really the standard. But in that case, Congress was looking at obstruction of justice and did not move forward on impeachment. So,
much to my chagrin.
Yes, I think many of us were chagrined at the time, but I just, in terms of kind of what is most would make most clear to the American public that that we have no king in this country and that no one is above the law. I'm not sure that that particular, as much as I was disturbed by it, as well as with the contacts, the multiple contacts with the Russian government and Russian agents, which were also not pursued, it seems to me that the other issues around the reality of crimes where there's been a real manipulation of potentially tax information, mortgage information, bank information, and so forth, that might be perhaps the more appropriate.
Let me just jump in and second something that Carolyn said, and that perhaps your constituents don't understand. Obstruction of justice is devilishly hard to prove in front of a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, because it is so much about intent and what is in a person's mind. And we are programmed as human beings to give people the benefit of the doubt. One of the reasons that we default to financial crimes like tax fraud or mortgage fraud is because basically you can prove it on the paper without anybody. And so, I mean, that's why Al Capone was caught on tax charges, right? Because they're I won't say they're easy to prove, but you've got paper records. So though I stand by the conclusion that there was ample evidence to start an obstruction investigation of the president, it would not surprise me at all if the end result of that was a jury that could not reach a verdict.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that would be an outcome that I think would be even more damaging.
Exactly.
Exactly. That's a
very
good point.
The President Trump would actually wave that around as a triumph, and use it to underscore his various lies about being a victim of some deep state and all the other nonsense that he talks about. And I think he'd use that as a way of kind of defending himself against the variety of other very strong charges that have been brought forward.
Let's go to the issue of pardons. I've got several questions from constituents about this. Susan asks, can someone who hasn't been convicted be pardoned, so preemptive pardons? Could the president legally undo his impeachment with the pardon power? I can answer that, no. He will always be one of only 3 presidents in American history who has been impeached. That's permanent. That's forever. Michael asks, will there be new legislation to prevent the president and anyone else from abusing the pardon power? So I know that there are constraints in the Constitution about what even Congress could do to sort of amplify or rewrite the law of pardons, because it's hardwired into the Constitution. But those are a few of these pardon questions we've been getting. Who wants to start on this one?
Well, maybe I'll just start quickly on to say there is the pardon of President Nixon is a precedent that we have here in terms of sort of prospective pardons without actually listing out the variety of potential crimes that he might have committed. So that's certainly, it's never been litigated. So whether it's valid or not, similarly, we don't know, can the president pardon himself? It seems counterintuitive that you shouldn't be able to be a judge in your own case. You shouldn't. But on the issue of whether, and maybe, and Paul, Paul and I were talking about a little bit when we first discussed this town hall with you, Congressman, about what Congress can do. So maybe I'll speak to that and then let Paul jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, it is constitutionally defined. There are things that I believe that Congress can do that have a lot to do with the kind of name and shame side of public disclosure. So I don't believe that Congress could actually prevent the president from pardoning generally, except I mean, we'll see about the self-pardon for that to occur. But Congress could certainly require a great amount of transparency around the files of dealing with investigations around the pardon power and so forth that might have been prepared. I think there is an effort to develop legislation along those lines that, particularly if there are close family members who are pardoned, that Congress would scrutinize that, again, have hearings, have get the records. It might not prevent it. but I think it would create a public awareness and pressure against doing so because of the shame that it would bring to the White House and to the president.
You know, I have to say, I wish I thought that that was, really an effective check. But, Congress did exactly that when on his way out the door, President Clinton pardoned a man named Mark Rich in something that he ought to have been ashamed of. And the next Congress had an extended investigation of it. And I almost am certain that nobody in America remembers that except me, maybe Caroline, and 6 or 7 other people. The problem here, and I don't know if it's a problem, if it's a feature or a bug, is that the pardon power was purposely made this way. My favorite story from when they wrote the Constitution was George Mason, who was one of the Constitutional Convention attendees, said we shouldn't have a pardon power at all because the president may frequently pardon crimes which were advised by himself, right? If he has the power of granting pardons before indictment or conviction, may he not stop inquiry and prevent detection? And he lost that debate. And James Madison said, well, no, because we'll impeach him for that, right? So that's kind of on you, Congressman, that they purposely made it as broad as possible. I think they were wrong in retrospect, but it's the decision we're kind of stuck with now.
Our founders were not perfect, and so here we are, though, with a constitutional provision that I think I'm hearing the two of you say can really only be changed in the ways we really need by a constitutional amendment. Is that fair?
I would say that's right. I mean, certainly record keeping and transparency are good things, and they might have some modest effects. But honestly, if name and shame is the game, then the question to ask is, do we think that the prospect of being shamed would deter somebody like Donald Trump from pardoning?
Well, yeah, it's a good point.
His daughter, if he chose to. And I think when you get to that point of giving out bad pardons, we're past the shaming state, I'm afraid.
And bribing for a pardon, do we?
Different question, separate crime.
Yeah.
The best view, it's never been tested, right? So obviously we don't know the answer to that because happily no president has ever been shown to have taken a bribe for a pardon. But the idea is that the pardon would still be effective. So the briber gets the benefit of his bargain, but the president has committed a separate crime.
Wow.
Right, and even Attorney General William Barr, who has the most aggressively maximalist view of executive power, in his confirmation hearing, agreed that it would actually be a crime.
Okay.
So,
now self-pardon? Do the two of you agree that this is just untested, but I would say dubious, likely to not be valid? What do you think?
Well, if you want the real balanced analysis, the answer is it's difficult to say. And here, the best argument in favor of self-pardoning is that they wrote the pardon power with 2 exceptions. You can't pardon for impeachment, and it's limited to offenses against the United States. So it doesn't cover state crimes. So they knew how to write limits in, and they didn't write, and you can't give one to yourself. So that's the argument in favor of self-pardon. The best argument against it is that they use the phrase grant a pardon. And it is really a strange construction of English to say, I'm granting myself something. Granting suggests giving it to another person, conferring a benefit. I granted you the boon of my attendance here. I didn't grant it to myself. And so I think the best argument is probably that he can't, but the only way to test it is for him to give it to himself and then for President Biden's Attorney General to decide to ignore that. And that, is that a political fight that they want to buy?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think there's one other piece, which is just that the backdrop of the revolution when the Constitution was adopted would lead us to think that the founders would not have created a situation where the president was above the law. But it's also possible they just didn't necessarily believe that there would be somebody like Donald Trump and that there would be other forces at work that would prevent that.
Yeah.
So,
So
but
one-
I agree with Paul that it's hard to imagine that it's hard to test because that it implies the prosecution by the federal government for a federal crime against the president after he
Good point.
pardons.
How do you ever get the ruling? Well, one last cleanup on this issue, and then I know our media partners are going to cut away because we just reached the 1 hour point. But the question of preempted pardons. Tell me if I get this wrong, counselor, professor, but you can't pardon for things that are done in the future, only things that have already been done. But you don't have to have already been faced with charges in order to have the benefit of a pardon. It is the act that you did, even if it hasn't resulted in a criminal charge, that you get relieved from. Did I get that right?
Exactly right.
All
It's
right.
also fairly untested, however. I think with the Nixon pardon, there was no it played out that way, but again, we don't have there are no cases that litigate it, so I think it's generally how we accept it, but the Supreme Court's never ruled on this.
So one of the accountability questions that people are wondering about, my colleagues and I are wondering about, is the preservation of records during this transition. One of my colleagues, Kay, writes, what is being done or should be done for the preservation of information and documents from the administration so we can hold them accountable? I don't know if either of you are experts on the Federal Records Act or the Presidential Records Act, but I think those are the two statutes that come into play here. And my colleagues and I have actually been thinking a lot about this. Even before the election, we sent letters to all of the key agencies in the administration, putting them on notice of their obligation under these two laws, making sure that there's no question that they know that they have to preserve these documents, and there is federal criminal exposure if they fail to do that. But I invite any thoughts that you have about making sure that the shredders aren't humming for the next 60 days at the White House.
Well, when we did transition, I mean, the way it works in practice is you get this notice, right? Do not delete anything from your computer. Do not throw out any paper. When you leave all of your electronics behind. I literally walked out of there with a box of pictures for my wall and some personal notes that were about, stuff I needed to bring home for my wife. And that was it. And I think you can expect that all of the civil servants will abide that very strictly. They understand it and they're not going to risk their lives. And I think you can probably expect that almost all of the presidential appointees outside the White House will likewise follow this, at least in part because it's really hard not to. I mean, in this digital age, everything's got backups. Everybody has official email accounts, and simply for IT security, every email has been saved to a file, for forever. I would not be, it is possible to think that inside the White House at a kind of really high level, there might be some things going on, but you can't plan for that kind of misconduct. It's just, it would be wrong. It would be very unfortunate, but there's nothing in law that you can do to stop it other than to try and uncover it and then punish people who do it.
I agree. I think the criminal liability potential for the political appointees who may not be experts in IT, they may worry that they even if they have a bad intention, that if they try and delete things, that they won't be good enough at covering it up or figuring out how to delete them permanently so that they can't be found. So I think that is definitely a disincentive. The thing that worries me less than that kind of deliberate erasure of documents is the fact that there has seemingly been a lot of communication that has happened on unofficial, exactly, on cell phones and other personal devices. The Trump family particularly has widely used them and pretty much been very open and flaunted the fact that they, and the president himself uses a personal cell phone to make calls to foreign leaders, which I think is a national security issue as well. We should be concerned about, but those kinds of conversations and records, things that might have been sent in an encrypted form, we won't be able to have access to that, I don't believe.
Oh, but don't worry, the Russians have it.
Okay, we'll just ask Vladimir.
Yeah.
We'll get it on WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to something that you alluded to a little earlier, Professor. You talked about things that Congress needs to do going forward to put some teeth in some of these laws where there should be accountability, but it's elusive under current law. And we've learned a lot in the last 4 years about those gaps. So this is a chance for the two of you to give me some homework assignments so that I can go back to my congressional colleagues and we can get to work on fixing some of these things. I will share with you a question I got from a constituent, Ann Ross, because she worded this so eloquently. I think it really frames this part of our conversation. She says, in a political context, the term hold accountable implies not just requiring an account, a story, but also specific consequences, that is, unassailably spelled out remedies and actions, just like the teeth in a contract. Thus far, our government has operated largely according to custom, that is, relying on understood agreements based on a code of honor. Will you, as our representative in Congress, undertake to codify these customs and norms and other things that have been revealed as so inadequate? So I put that to you.
Well, I commend you actually, Congressman Huffman, for already having moved forward very strongly in this area. I think HR 1 and HR 4 have really put some very strong ideas into circulation, dealing with reform. I think we could talk. There are lots of different areas, and those bills deal with a number of different issues. But we have issues around transparency and ethics that I think maybe we should focus on now. Again, one of the things that we had always expected of our presidents, or at least in recent history, was transparency about their financial situation, about their taxes, about their investments. And that is an area that really needs to be strengthened. We can't depend any longer on a presidential candidate being willing to disclose to the American public what his or her financial entanglements might be. I think we can get back to the national security issues once again. There was a lot of rumor mongering, perhaps is how to put it, or suspicion that some of the investments that the Trump family had in places like Russia might have caused him to have a variety of dependencies on Putin and other foreign leaders that could have been damaging to it. So we need to know in advance. The American public needs to know what the financial situation is of presidents. Do they have huge debts, et cetera? And so that clearly is something we can't depend on norms. So I think that's very very important. There needs to be divestment. Well, the president is in office. There needs to be oversight by the Office of Government Ethics. And I think we also understand that members of Congress need to be subject to similar kinds of issues of transparency and enforcement of clear financial rules, trading on of stocks that relate to business in front of your committee. It's really troubling. So those are just a few. I mean, there are lots of things that need to be done, but I think those are sort of top of my mind.
Yeah, thank you for flagging the financial piece and HR 1, because we do need to bring an end to this insider trading scourge that is, I mean, it's amazing. Both candidates in this Georgia Senate runoff have a dark cloud of insider trading hanging all over them. What are the odds of that? And let me agree with you that we can't count on future presidential candidates just following the norm of disclosure to be transparent. We also can't count on them keeping their promise, even if in the campaign they say they're going to. Because Trump said he would, and then he reneged. He said he would create a blind trust, and then he reneged. So clearly some teeth are in order. Paul, what other homework do you have for Congress?
Well, this is a great question, and actually, I think your constituent was Ann. Was her name?
Yeah.
had it exactly right, that we've relied so much on norms. Let me take it in a different direction. My fixation on national security, and actually pose for you and for Anne a real problem, which is that in the world we live in today, we need to give the executive lots of emergency discretionary authority to respond to true emergencies. We want the president to be able to respond to a Russian invasion of Georgia, immediately without, having Congress to come back in and authorize too much. We need emergency discretionary authority. The problem that we've seen in the last 4 years is that we rely on our presidents to use that authority with wisdom, not always correctly or what we agree with, but for the good of the nation. And what we've seen instead is a president who has taken that emergency authority and moved money around to build walls, or, I mean, my least favorite of these was declaring a national security emergency to impose tariffs on steel from Canada.
Yes.
As if Canada were an enemy of the United States and this was a real national security imperative, as opposed to an economic issue that may or may not be real, but isn't a national security. So here's my homework for you.
Okay.
How do we go forward by constraining that discretionary authority so that presidents can't use it again in this kind of bad way, while at the same time still leaving behind what I think we would all agree is necessary, which is the actual ability of a president to respond in the moment if the Chinese carriers go into the Taiwan Strait and are threatening Taiwan. I think that the answer lies in things like time limits, reporting requirements, time limits, enhanced justifications, maybe judicial review provisions that allow, because a lot of the emergency funding things that the president has done have proven to be immune from judicial review because nobody has a cause of action to complain about them. So things like that. But, I'm all in on financial transparency and health transparency and things like that. But actually, I'm much more worried at the next higher level with presidents who misuse the actual powers we give them for their own benefit to the detriment of our national security.
Yeah. Well, that's a great assignment, cleaning up all these zombie emergency authorities, some of which the Trump lawyers have found from the 1950s that were just blue sky emergency authorities that we've left open-ended. That's a great one. I will add to the ones the two of you have mentioned, the emoluments clause. That has to have meaning, and yet we've seen through these legal challenges that unless we sharpen the definition of emoluments and really clarify how a president needs to seek approval from Congress, it's going to invite abuse, I think, in the future. And then one more that I will give myself homework assignments on is congressional oversight authorities. I think we've always just assumed that, while there is a tension between the branches of government, that a congressional subpoena meant something, that you had to comply, that you had to come and testify, that you couldn't just make up things like absolute immunity. And yet, it takes 4 years to litigate any of that. And by that time, the first term in office is over and he's gotten away with it.
I think you should be thinking about,
though, right?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to, sorry, Paul. I was just going to say, I think you have some potential, or you have legislation that you can move dealing with inherent contempt authority that would put some muscle behind your subpoenas, which wouldn't require you to go spend years in the courtroom before you get a decision. So that's there for you already.
Well, I was going to say an even easier fix: just pass a law that says that the courts must adjudicate these disputes on an expedited time frame. Give them 30 days, right? 60 if you want to be generous. You're done in 180 days for 3 levels.
Fantastic. Well, gosh, I wish we had another hour to go into this. This has been a great conversation. I want to close, though, with a terrific final question I got from a constituent named Barry, who just asks broadly, how do you look upon the problem of our divided nation? And I think it's a great sort of closing reflection for all of us. And I want to invite the two of you for your thoughts, and I'll share some of mine. And let me take this opportunity as we bring it to an end to just thank both of you for a fantastic conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. And that is maybe the hardest question of all, I have to say, because it's one that we're all saddened by, how incredibly polarized the country is right now. I feel somewhat better as the days have gone by since the election, as we've started to see a number of Republican leaders acknowledge that President-elect Biden has won the election. I think Senator Alexander, in his swan song speech in front of the Senate, talked about his dismay over how the Senate itself has kind of becomes a center of polarization, and how negative it has been, and how little the two parties work together anymore. Maybe this is a moment we can move forward from. There are always, I'm a policy person, so there's always some policy ideas, but I do think fixing our election system is one that we really need to deal with. Again, going back to HR 1 and HR 4, there are some really important ideas in there. Gerrymandering is something that needs to clearly be addressed, because that adds to the hyperpolarization. But it's an existential question in many ways. How do we move through this so that we can, people will never agree on everything. But the idea that you have people who just will deny that the election was actually fairly held, and will deny that President-elect Biden was fairly chosen. It speaks to a lot of work that I hope the next administration will be able to successfully do to bring people back together. But I'm not. I think the wounds are pretty deep right now, so I'm not sure.
Well, like Carolyn, I want to start by just thanking you for inviting me. I truly am honored to have been asked to join you today, Congressman. I appreciate it. And I think I'll answer this question in a different way, a more personalized way, which is that one of the things I think I've learned over the last 4 years is that for too much of my career, I saw disagreements about politics in personalized terms. I'd like to think I was never quite as mean or rude as some on the political stage today, but reflecting back on it, I sometimes fell too much into the us versus them mentality of politics, team over principle. And, going forward, I have committed myself, and I'm sure I will fail because I am a human being and I'm imperfect, but I've committed myself to trying very hard to recognize that I can disagree without being disagreeable. And that, as our discussions have demonstrated, we have the same end goal in mind, which is good for America. And we may just disagree on the means to get there, but our end goals are the same. And so I've kind of promised myself going forward to personally take that mantle up and live that. And if everybody who's listening takes that mantle up and lives that, we can start to heal the wounds. It's going to take a while, I'm afraid, but that's the best way I know to contribute to it, is to lead, be an example of thoughtful discussion. And if we disagree, I'll say so to somebody, but I will stop thinking that I think that they must be evil if they don't agree with me.
Well, thank you for that. I think how we say things matters. And I've appreciated the way President-elect Biden has framed this, that there's a difference between being an adversary and being an enemy. And we've lost the distinction, I think, in our current politics. So I think, like the two of you, I believe all of us, including myself, has a role. Anyone who thinks that this thing is just going to be solved by people in Washington, no, it's way deeper. It's way more complicated than that. The people you send to Washington actually reflect millions of other people who are out there in this divided country that are tuning in to the different cable stations that fan the divisions. So there's just a lot more to it than who we send to Washington. It's on all of us. And I'd like to think we've done a little bit of a service to this question tonight, bringing together our own maybe Ginsburg-Scalia combo in the two of you, showing that people from different perspectives can have really thoughtful and constructive engagement. And we'll just try to build on that going forward. So thanks for a great town hall. Thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight to join us. I hope we can do more of these in the future, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.